Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to the latest edition of the ESG Show. This is our 5th show, and if you've been watching us from day one, welcome, and if you're new to the show, welcome too. The ESG Show, for those who don't know, is a weekly event in which we talk about what's interesting in ESG, what's controversial in ESG, what's hotly debated in ESG. And the purpose is manifold, really. It's partly to help people who work in ESG to understand and consider some of the issues in more depth. It's to support people who are new to ESG and want to have a better understanding of it. And it's also to fly the ESG flag. And what I mean by that is evangelize ESG to the wider community, especially in areas where it's quite controversial. Somebody asked me recently, what does the ESG flag look like then? And I didn't have an answer to that because I mean it metaphorically. I'm not suggesting there is a literal ESG flag. And today we're being joined by an amazing selection of guests. And our theme for today's ESG show is, or at least our group discussion at the end of the show today, is ESG, the ultimate silo buster. It's interesting. Silos used to be the way business was done. You know, your finance department, your marketing department, your engineers, your production, and never the twain did they meet. And these days, the idea is we all work together. And on the topic of breaking down silos, just to show that there are no geographical silos with the ESG show, our 3 guests this morning, including myself, stretch across the globe. We have 2 guests this morning from the east coast of the United States. We have myself talking to you from the south coast of England. And we have a 4th guest speaking to you from New Zealand, which, by the way, has created horrendous time scheduling. Some of our guests, it's very early in the morning. For one of our guests, it's very late in the evening. And for me, it's a nice and civilized 11 a.m. Anyway, today I am being joined by Jonathan Ha. Jonathan.
Hello.
Good morning.
Yes, and good evening.
So what's the time where you are then at the moment?
It's currently 10 p.m. here in New Zealand.
10 p.m. Okay. Well, thank you for staying up late. Hope you didn't need any matchsticks to keep your eyes open or anything like that. Jonathan is the founder and CEO of Seneca ESG, a business intelligence company delivering solutions for corporate sustainability assessment, reporting, and integration with financial services. Mr. Ha is a seasoned entrepreneur and technology advisor and has experience applying AI, machine learning, big data, and blockchain technologies to solve the real world problems. So, Jonathan, tell us a little bit more about what Seneca does and what are the problems that it solves?
Sure, happy to. Thank you, Michael, and glad to be here. So Seneca ESG is a cloud software solutions provider, and what we aim to do is to simplify and automate complex ESG workflows for corporates, financial institutions, government agencies, such as regulators and stock exchanges. And we have 2 main flagship solutions. One is called EPIC for corporates, and that's spelled EPIC. And this provides overall end-to-end ESG data management, including collection, aggregation, approval, and audit workflows, internal analytics, visualization, reporting, and data-driven gap analyses, goal setting, and improvement. So quite a lot of workflow management all packaged into a single solution called EPIC for corporates. And we do have a separate solution called Zeno, Z-E-N-O for financial institutions, that helps to create custom ESG scoring and assessments tailored to specific situations, dependent upon different strategies, different asset classes, different geo or sector focus, and perhaps most critically, differing LP preferences at both the portfolio level and the individual asset level.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. And a little bit of AI thrown in there as well, I think.
There's a bit of that as well, absolutely.
Okay. Well, I just have notification that among our viewers today, we have viewers in Holland, India, and South Africa. So our guests might stretch across the world, but our viewers stretch even further. Also joining us today on the ESG show from the East Coast of the United States is Natalie Runyon.
Good morning.
Good morning, Natalie. So what's the time where you are?
It is 6:06 a.m.
6:06. Well, thank you very much for getting up early for us. Whereabouts on the East Coast are you?
I'm based in New York City.
Oh, you're in New York City. Okay. So Natalie is an expert at the intersection of culture, talent, and ESG. She curates and creates content at the Thomson Reuters Institute on all three topics. Her thought leadership can be found within the TRI's ESG Resource Centre, where she has written more than 75 articles. In addition, Natalie has produced more than 200 articles on talent, inclusion, and culture since she joined the TR Institute in 2018. So Natalie, intersection of culture, talent, and ESG, and you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So I think I have the best job in the world because I get to talk to people and write about their insights based on the interviews that I have with them. So I joined the Thomson Reuters Institute in 2018, where I focused on covering talent, inclusion, and culture issues for the legal and tax and accounting industries, which are two of the main industries that Thomson Reuters serves, in addition to our Reuters news brand. And then about a year ago, when it came time, because we also serve risk professionals too, and across, and we kept hearing mainly through greenwashing that, it was becoming a thing. And so that was involving our lawyers, that a decision was made to create an ESG resource center. So it was like, congratulations, Natalie, you're not getting an extra headcount. So you get the job of covering it. So it's been an extremely rewarding topic to cover. And I've been covering it for more than a year now, mainly focused on how it's impacting the workflows of lawyers, accountants, and risk professionals.
Okay, thank you, Natalie. Now, I'm going to have to disagree with you on one topic there. I think presenting the ESG show is the best job in the world. So we're going to have to agree to disagree.
We can have that debate.
We can indeed. Okay. Also joining us today on the ESG show is Josh Jacobson. Good morning to you, Josh. I believe it's where you are as well.
Yeah, good morning, Michael. Good to see everyone coming to you also from the East Coast, Charlotte, North Carolina. And it is also just past 6 a.m.
Well, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you very much for getting up so early. So Josh is the founder and CEO of Next Stage, a US-based social impact company working at the intersection of social good. Josh works with the private sector to develop strategy to support external S, how companies work to positively impact social metrics and are traditionally outside their direct internal management. So, Josh, tell us a little bit about Next Stage.
Yeah, happy to do it. And you noted we're a social impact company, which is kind of a unique title. There's not many of us, but what that means is that we work on the design and implementation of measurable social impact strategies. We work with private sector, nonprofits, municipalities. Really, we work across a kind of intersection of institutions that need to work cohesively and collectively to advance positive social outcomes. As it relates to today's topic, we're working with the private sector, particularly to design and implement strategies that serve the S in ESG. And we're particularly interested in corporate citizenship efforts that, as you noted, extend beyond the walls of the company. This is a new area we think companies are struggling in some ways to conceptualize and implement effectively because it's not exactly down the company, it's more out in community. So we work with them to help them develop those strategies.
Thank you very much, Josh. Good to know you're pushing the S so hard. Now we turn to the part of the ESG show when we look at a news story. So we're getting a little bit topical on you this morning. And today's news story is from ISS Corporate Solutions. US shareholder proposals jump to a new record in 2023. Investors raised their voices at US annual general meetings in the first 5 months of 2023 with social issues such as diversity, equity, and inclusion, and a new wave of anti-ESG sentiment, fueling a record number of shareholder proposals and analysis by ISS Corporate Solutions found. Okay, Natalie, Josh, what are your thoughts about this story?
Well, so my thoughts are, in the spirit of there's no such thing as bad publicity. I think what this indicates is that ESG is truly a mainstream issue, right? And so when there's progress, there's usual a force of to oppose the movement. So I don't think, and you can look back in history and see that is pretty typical. But I think in terms of the part of the story that's about the anti-ESG sentiment wave, we're seeing some of the backlash of ESG from the politicization of it. And so some lawmakers in the US are what I would call mischaracterizing ESG from what it really is. Because when I talk to lawyers, when I talk to accountants, when I talk to risk professionals, they kind of characterize ESG as an expanded lens of analyzing risks and opportunities from a wider lens of performance beyond exclusively the financial lens. And so what that basically means is that there are intangible indicators, right, that definitely influence the bottom line and financial performance that typically don't show up on financial statements. And so some of these intangibles are the ones that I focus on are around the S as well. So organizational culture, value, diversity, inclusion, health and well-being, and employee experience. And all of those are absolutely financially material. And so these lawmakers are citing antitrust concerns to discourage industry-level collaboration and efforts to standardize ESG measures, reporting and disclosure to increase efficiency and effectiveness. And so that's what some of the reasons for the backlash and kind of what the concerns are that they're citing. But based on that level, those antitrust concerns, the lawyers that I talked to is that as long as there's no collusion around price, at least in the U.S., tread carefully, but consultation with your lawyers. But at the end of the day, there's no antitrust or collusion going on. So that's at least what my sources tell me. So,
okay, so there's an element of misunderstanding there. There's an element of not really understanding what ESG represents behind some of the critique then. Okay, and thank you for bringing a little bit of physics into the show this morning. Not only are we talking about ESG, but we've also introduced Newton's third law, which says for every action in nature, there is an equal and opposite reaction. So there you have it. For every ESG action, there is that's positive, there's an ESG reaction against it. Josh, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah.
Not about Isaac Newton. I'm not asking you to talk about Isaac Newton.
I won't comment on Newton, but maybe the idea that this equal and opposite reaction construct. So shareholder proposals are a long-time strategy in advancing social cause. So we can go back to the 1960s and the civil rights movement in the United States, where Amtrak became kind of front page news as shareholders of color were using it as a shareholder proposals as a means to advance the civil rights and equality. So it may not be a surprise then that shareholder proposals are now being advanced from the other side, if you will, of wanting to halt social evolution. But to me, it's a little bit of the sort of the vocal minority, if you will. Everything that we know about generational change and sort of the momentum of ESG suggests that this is like putting sticks in a river. We're not going to be able to stop the trend line that's coming, but we're seeing strategies to attempting to do that. So for our purposes, we see it as noise and not material really to the ongoing trend line that we're helping to support.
Okay, so I'm not sure how famous this story is outside of the UK. Maybe it is famous, I don't know. But according to English mythology, there was a king called King Canute who commanded the tide to stop. But it didn't stop. And so is it a little bit like that? People are trying to stop the ESG tide to stop, but it's inexorable.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair summary, really, of if you look at social progress over the millennium. We often see this as we hear it gets louder, frankly, before the dam breaks. And I think that's the moment we're in right now, certainly in the United States.
Okay, thank you very, very much. Now we turn to that part of the ESG show when I speak to each of our guests individually. But before I do that, I just wanted to say a little bit about next week's show. Now, this week we talk about Isaac Newton. And next week we're going to be talking about AI and ESG. So not Isaac Newton, but some pretty advanced stuff. Now, unless you've been living on Mars recently, then chances are that you've heard quite a lot about AI recently. I sometimes wonder that if you have been living on Mars recently, whether maybe you've seen Elon Musk over there, because I sometimes have this suspicion that he could be a Martian himself. And yet he seems to know more about AI than almost everyone. So it seems to me that even living on Mars isn't an excuse for not knowing about AI at the moment. And next week, we're being joined by Sue Turner, OBE, Carrie Sheehan, who among many other things is an advisor at the Alan Turing Institute, and the brilliant tech regulation journalist Robert Bateman. So join us next week for the ESG show, AI and ESG, I was going to say, slightly early at the same time, but I'm not sure about that, so I won't tell you what the time is. Now I'm being joined by Jonathan again, and we're going to have a chat about the role of technology and the ESG performance. Jonathan, welcome back to the show. Now, tell me a little bit about the role of technology in making ESG performance more accessible and actionable.
Sure, happy to. So I think it follows a similar trend as with any new concept. Initially, it's, and just to follow on from what we had just spoken about the backlash and the form that it's taking now in the form of shareholder proposals. But initially, these processes, these workflows are very manual in nature. And it's because it's new to everyone. It's something that people need to become educated upon. There needs to be a certain amount of consensus that's reached as to why it is that we're actually going about and undertaking this organizational change. And there is no lack of organizational change that needs to be undertaken to take a more robust approach to incorporating ESG best practices and continuous improvement approaches to sustainability. And over time, as that consensus starts to be established, there are some workflows, some processes that become more repeatable, right? And it's knowing what data you need to collect related to your carbon emissions. It's what data you need to collect and prepare related to DEI, so diversity, equity, and inclusion, and employee health and safety, so on and so forth. So when there's a certain degree of familiarity that's been reached, and these workflows, these processes become a bit more repeatable, that's when technology really has a big opportunity to play a role in helping to simplify and hopefully, in many cases, automate these workflows. Because up until now, these have been very manual. And one of the big complaints for corporates, especially those that are on the ground and having to actually implement ESG workflows and to identify areas where they can improve, is that it's very, very manual. So it's a lot of Excel work. It's a lot of looking through paper invoices. It's a lot of reaching out, making phone calls, trying to figure out exactly where this data is being held and how to best aggregate and prepare it for regulatory compliant reporting. But it's very similar to what we saw as an evolution in the accounting space. So financial accounting is very data heavy as well. And a lot of that data may not necessarily be in just one place, right? But over the last several decades, where there has been more of a maturization of those principles, the disclosure rules, and so on and so forth, we now see software playing a very large role in helping to essentially streamline and automate that entire process. So now it's a no-brainer. There's no company, whether it's as small as 2 people or as large as 20,000 people, that doesn't use software to manage their financial data. And I think the same will be true for ESG data.
Okay, so would you say then that ESG is changing from a nice to have to a need to have? And if so, how is that affecting corporate mentality towards ESG?
Sure, absolutely. So I'll speak a little bit more on what is the driver of changing corporate mentality from viewing ESG as a nice to have to a need to have. And it's really just one word: it's regulation. A lot of companies, and this is, for better or worse, they're really not going to do anything new when it comes to ESG and sustainability until they're pushed to do so, right? And the key driver for companies to do so is still regulation. Now, there are other, reasons. I think there are nice to have elements to ESG that have encouraged and inspired corporate leaders to implement sustainability best practices, to continuously improve. And what began with more of a marketing, reputational spin sort of element, I think has now evolved to something that's much more robust, something that's more long-term and sustainable, to use that word that we're using in many different applications nowadays. But to look beyond just merely a CEO's pet project or an interest in bolstering the image of a company. I think now that ESG has been firmly embedded within regulators' minds, stock exchange management's minds, as a required element for listing as well as continued listing, it's now become a need to have. And so we look across different markets globally. It's oftentimes the stock exchanges that are leading the charge in requiring and forcing change across the board when it comes to better ESG disclosure. And that's really exciting to see.
Okay, thank you. And what about your thoughts about future trends and developments in ESG? We are running short on time, by the way, Jonathan. So
okay,
if you try and make this a quick answer.
Yeah, try to be a bit more concise. So future trends and developments. First, consolidation of ESG disclosure standards. So we're currently facing a bit of an alphabet soup of different disclosure frameworks. We have the GRI, the SASB, TCFD, CDP, integrated reporting framework. And we're now getting to a point where finally there's some consolidation. And we see that in the ISSB, bringing together many of those well-known standards. We're not there just yet, but hopefully within the next 12 to 24 months, we'll start to see global adoption across the board of that single standard, but probably we'll still have some sector-specific standards remaining. So that's one thing, consolidation of disclosure standards. The second future trend is a transition of ESG ratings from being viewed as static methodologies to being more dynamic and more akin to financial modeling, in that every good analyst, every good portfolio manager, every CIO at a financial institution may have a different view as to how they're using ESG data to form an outlook on a company, to form an outlook on a portfolio. And that's okay. ESG is a very subjective concept overall. And in our view, there is no single right way of conducting an ESG assessment on a company or a portfolio. It is very much informed by what is your objective, what are the firm's own approach to ESG, and perhaps most critically, the investor base, the actual LPs' own preferences when it comes to ESG. And then finally, technology obviously playing a much greater role here in helping to simplify and automate all of these workflows.
Okay, and two more very, very quick questions. What advice would you give to a startup then, looking to integrate ESG strategies?
Well, for a startup, I would say start small, because ESG disclosure practices has really been geared more for the largest of the large companies, so to speak. It's those large corporates that are typically already publicly listed. So you certainly don't want to take on more than you can handle, especially if you're an early stage startup. But doing so and starting early is a good idea. It demonstrates to your constituents, to your shareholders, and your perhaps your VC investors, that you have an eye on things such as sustainability. And this would really, I think, allow you to set yourself apart from other startups in the space that may not be as focused on sustainability from the get-go.
Okay, and in one, I might give you 2 sentences. How does Seneca differentiate itself in the marketplace?
Sure. So Seneca differentiates herself by future-proofing our solution. And that essentially means we look at every regulation globally. We look at all best practices globally, and we have over 60 different disclosure frameworks and workflows built into our software. And we also differentiate ourselves by viewing ESG as not merely a compliance exercise. Tick the box, and off we go, and let's not worry about this until the next year. Instead, we view ESG as also an opportunity for continuous improvement. And with our software, you're able to track, measure, and set goals for how you want to improve upon your sustainability practices in real time, rather than waiting until the end of your reporting cycle to be completed.
Jonathan, thank you very, very much. See you again in a few minutes when we do our group discussion. And now I'd like to welcome back Natalie Runyon. Hello again, Natalie.
Hello.
Natalie, I would like to ask you, how about the framing of ESG? And ESG is typically framed as based on value in financial terms, or values in terms of purpose and impact. You say both. You say it's financial and purpose and impact. Why is that?
Well, thanks for the opportunity to elaborate on that. So I think the value approach of ESG, as you said, focuses on the financial terms, but it's also about analyzing risks and opportunities through an expanded lens of environmental, social, and governance. And so the values approach is typically about seeking feedback from your stakeholders, and the fact that doing good feels good and is also good for business and the community. And the problem with that, with looking at it one or the other, is that it's an either or, when in reality it's and. And so I'm going to come back to what I focus on, which is a lot of the internal parts of the S. And what I said before about framing ESG around employees. Employees are absolutely essential to the execution of a company strategy, right? So their work, their view is financially material. What do I mean by that? And I think this concept of financial materiality, which is at the baseline of any materiality assessment that you go through when you're starting to create a strategy, is the intersecting point of value and values. So let me demonstrate with some data. Let's just take diversity and inclusion. It's financially material. According to McKinsey, companies in the top quartile for race and ethnic diversity are 35% more likely to have financial returns above their respective industry average means. Positive employee engagement is financially material. According to Gallup, companies with an engaged workforce are 21% more profitable. Organizational culture is financially material. According to Deloitte, organizations with inclusive cultures are 2 times more likely to exceed financial targets, 3 times more likely to be high performing, and 8 times more likely to achieve better business outcomes. So I always come back to the business, which is about the risk and opportunities, as an argument for that ESG is beyond just doing good and feeling good, because these elements, these intangible elements, the ones that don't show up on financial statements, are absolutely financially material, as I've just demonstrated.
Okay, thank you. And also, can you just talk very briefly about the role of culture within ESG, corporate culture and ESG?
Of course. Well, culture is the glue of everything, right? So let's go back to defining what culture is, because it is one of those more nebulous concepts. But it's the daily manifestation of an organization's explicit performance expectations and its implicit behavioral norms in terms of what is rewarded, what is punished, what is overlooked, and what is tolerated. So, and culture is delivered through employees' day-to-day interactions, through one-on-one conversations with manager, through team meetings, whether those are happening in person, virtually, or some combination of both. And so because culture is an active living delivered through mechanism that's delivered through people's interactions, it absolutely impacts ESG, because when it comes to ESG, and ESG is a silo buster, which is our topic for the day, right? You have to have collaboration, you have to have trust, you have to have transparency, and so and you have to have accountability. So those are all the essential values, if you will, that are weaving that collaboration together. And so that is delivered through culture. And so from that perspective, that is the role of culture in ESG. It's about the values and the spirit of collaboration, transparency, accountability, which I think for any organization today would be hard to argue that those are valuable practices and concepts to employ within your organization.
Okay, thank you. Now, I want to ask you about the integration of ESG within a business. How do you know when it's fully integrated, or maybe it's one of those things that can never be fully integrated. Maybe it's a journey that lasts forever. I don't know.
Well, I think it's fully integrated when we don't need to call ESG, right?
Okay.
It just becomes part of the DNA of an organization because it's an expanded lens of analyzing risks and opportunities, taking into a wider lens of your stakeholders, which for an organization are its employees, if shareholders, if they're public, private owners, if they're not public, customers, suppliers, and the local communities in which they operate in. And so that's where, so when we don't have to call it ESG, that's how we'll know that that it's fully integrated in the business, because we just call it business.
So maybe a little bit like, electricity. When you walk through the door, you don't say, I'm going to turn the electricity on. You say, I'm going to turn the lights on. We don't talk about electricity. We talk about what it does. And maybe that's when we've ESG, we made it, I suppose. Natalie, thank you very, very much, and see you again in a few minutes. Now I'm being joined again by Josh. Now, Josh, you've coined the new term, external S.
Yes.
What does that mean?
Yeah, thank you, Michael. The exploration of ESG, of course, we know each of the letters in the initialism. And the environmental side has had some very clear metrics, governance also, and social has traditionally been defined through an internal lens. So DEI and employee wellness, typically down the company. So, how are policies set by the company that inform the ways in which internal decisions are made. Increasingly, what we're seeing are companies being held accountable to their external expressions of their values, as Natalie was describing. And so we get out of the area of things that a company can directly impact through decision-making into a space where we need to be more collaborative. So as we think about citizenship efforts, which have traditionally been expressed as corporate social responsibility, CSR, that has been a kind of feel-good, squishy space of less strategic activity, and we're seeing it become far more, focused, but it lacks metrics. So right now, GRI and regulators are really only looking at what we would call outputs. How much money are you spending in community, traditionally with nonprofit organizations and other investments you might make? What are you doing with volunteer hours? So it's all aggregating, but it's not being held accountable the way the rest of ESG is being held accountable to outcomes. And we think that's the next horizon for where regulators and reporting agencies are going to be looking. Is how do you, as a company, hold yourself accountable to how those dollars and hours and investment in community translate, and that includes taking a stand on social issues, which of course typically make headlines because those can rile some of the folks that we were talking about earlier. So it's a bit of a space that challenges companies, and our company Next Stage really exists to help them factor in how consumers, employees, and shareholders all are stakeholders in the company. And as stakeholders, how does do those metrics translate also into profitability? At the end of the day, companies that align to ESG are often driven there, by regulators, but we believe that there are, bottom line serving reasons to do it, and we hope to translate that.
Okay, thank you. Now I'm going to ask you to give me a hard example. You mentioned you mentioned a company lining external S to its materiality. Yeah. So what can you give me an example of that?
Yeah, well, that's one of the big things that's changing about corporate social responsibility and citizenship efforts. Whereas previously, I think as Jonathan was describing, kind of nice to haves, they were often initiatives driven by chief executive or the C-suite based on their individual interests. Well, now we're looking at the company's materiality. So what matters to the stakeholders of that company? What matters to consumers? What matters to employees? And the rise of what matters to shareholders. So while socially responsible investing has existed for a long time, in our recent report, we walked through the history of this. It's significantly growing. Somewhere around $1 in every 5 invested in the public sector, publicly traded companies is in ESG related funds. So this is a huge piece of the puzzle now for companies, and a shareholder disruption comes in. So now a company really needs to think about, how do I end up in those ESG portfolios? What are the evaluative measures that are going to decide whether we are or not expressed that way? And so they're looking at their own materiality. So a good example would be a financial services company. When a low to moderate income individual seeks a mortgage to buy a new home, that's a moment of potential economic mobility. Are we going to help that family secure their future and create generational wealth that will change the course of that family? A lot of financial services companies have to look at credit worthiness. Is this a lend-worthy person? And we're not asking to change the status of that person. We're not asking companies to make risky investments, but rather, how are they helping that person become more lend-worthy? So while they might turn someone down for a loan, how are they in turn helping that person improve their credit rating so that they can become more likely to secure a mortgage? That's an example of why a financial services company would maybe invest into financial literacy programs in community, why they would work with organizations that are, working at the community level to advance those causes. So whereas previously we may have seen sponsorship kind of related to galas and luncheons and 5K walks and those sorts of things, we're starting to see more alignment between what matters to the company and what matters to the community, and bringing those two things together. We think that will be a big part of the sort of sector by sector expression of external S going forward.
Josh, thank you very, very much. We're running tight on time. I'll have to close it there, but I'll see you again in about 90 seconds to talk about ESG, the Silo Buster. I'm not going to read out any questions today, but there's just a few observations that we've received from the audience, which I thought I'd draw your attention to. Zoe Amanda Buckley says, as an ESG admin, I would definitely appreciate a more automated system. I suppose that's the plus side of automation. It just makes life easier. Srilaskami Menon says, yes, Michael, I think ESG is a silo buster. It requires a strategy shift within an outside organization, and cross-department or cross-company collaboration is required. And finally, Lorato Nguyen said, Lorato Nguyen says, integration is a continued improvement with the growth of the organization. Now we turn to the final segment of the show today, ESG, the ultimate silo buster. And I'd like to welcome back Jonathan, Natalie, and Josh, and kick off with a question for you, Jonathan. So just how is ESG software related to breaking down corporate? How does ESG software break down corporate silos?
Yeah, so quick answer is that the ESG software in itself doesn't break down silos, of course. That change has to come from the management team. It has to come from the cultural change that is necessary to want to embrace sustainability best practices and to implement ESG initiatives internally. And the software is really just a tool, once that's already been established, right? And then I'm sort of thinking back to my organizational behavior MBA courses, and that can be very difficult to do, and it could take many forms. But the software itself is really just a tool of how you can implement something that we like to call a single point of truth. And once you've had enough of a consensus built internally that this is something that everyone is behind, and it acts as a very useful tool to be able to coordinate all of those workflows.
Okay, thank you for that. And maybe I'll need to rewind a little bit, Natalie, and just ask you a more general question. How is ESG a corporate silo buster?
Well, ESG is a corporate silo buster because there is a spider web of corporate functions that are involved in ESG data collection, analysis, reporting, and disclosure. And so we see this showing up in two ways, and elements of this have already been mentioned. So in the first segment, Jonathan talked about the data, right? And all the challenges that it's very manual. Well, you have different data owners. So for example, you have the facilities or real estate team that needs to start collecting scope 1 and 2, carbon emissions data. They have to analyze that, but someone has to approve it, right? And so that might be the legal function. You have ownership of employee related data, employee engagement, DEI information. HR is going to own that. So they need to do that, collect that data, analyze it, and then it has to be reviewed and approved by a different function. We see finance professionals because, as Jonathan already talked about, the accounting and finance professional has been doing this for decades at this point, and software is a huge tool that enables that. Well, so ESG data is still in the very nascent stage around that. So in order to break down those silo busters, Jonathan's absolutely right. The software is a tool to do that, but there has to be processes and protocols around it, right? And right now, there's a lot of ambiguity in ESG. People don't understand who the roles and responsibilities are. What framework is it going to be? What does ESG mean to employees? And so there's a lot of confusion. And so as part of that ambiguity, the entire organization is learning, right, as we go. And so that can be very confusing. That can be difficult in the moment when you're just trying to get stuff done. And so but at the end of the day, because ESG requires multiple data owners, multiple corporate functions being involved, and there's already likely an existing enterprise risk framework, right? ESG risk framework has to be bolted onto that. And not separate. And so there's a lot of change involved in that. And so with that collaboration is really necessary. And so that's basically why ESG is a silo buster.
Okay, thank you for that, Natalie. And Josh, now I believe you feel that middle market companies are better positioned for this silo busting. Why do you think that?
Yeah, well, I'm just the nimbleness. So as Natalie was describing, that change management inside very large, infrastructures takes time. And a smaller, more mid-sized company is probably better positioned to navigate that change because they're often starting from scratch. They may not have infrastructure in place. And so it's not kind of redevelopment, it's developing. And we speak on this quite a bit because our target audience is the middle market, because they're really the ones that are waking up to this ESG headlines that are impacting their own company. The publicly traded companies have been at this for a long time. They in our space of corporate social responsibility, they already have defined infrastructure. But many of these middle market companies where we see so much potential, if we could win the privately held middle market to embrace this across, make this a best practice, we think we could really, advance things. And they're waking up to new RFPs coming from companies that, their biggest customer who hasn't, put it out for bid for more than a decade, suddenly there's a new RFP that lands on the desk, and it's exactly the same as the previous RFP from back 10, 20 years ago, except bolted on the bottom, all these questions about their ESG strategy. That CEO, COO immediately goes to Google and starts searching what's out there. What is this space? I'm being asked to do something that we don't have in place. So they have what I think Jonathan is describing, as a regulatory moment. That in this case, it's their customer that's creating an impetus to do something, and we see that sort of motivation as something useful. Frankly, we can work with a motivated company that really wants to see this implemented. So that risk framework becomes also balanced by a business imperative. We need this in place so that we can, remain, valid and solvent. That's a big motivator. So in terms of busting silos that may exist and building the culture, nothing like a crisis, the crisis of a new RFP from your biggest customer to get things done.
Okay, thank you. And talking about moments, Jonathan, we've just got a few moments now to address our last few questions. And in just a few moments, can you just talk about the how we break down the barriers to these internal silos? What can be done to address them?
Sure. And I think one of the key steps to breaking down the internal silos is trying to rally around a single consensus view, as to why we're doing so. And one of the things that that we have found to be quite an interesting development is how the CFO's office is now getting involved. And it used to be that it was perhaps the marketing department. It could have come from the C-level suite, and now we're transitioning to a point where there's actually an economic impact to the company if they're not being more proactive and rigorous when it comes to understanding ESG, implementing ESG best practices. And that can be based upon its stock price and how it's impacted by its ratings that MSCI or Sustainalytics may have given it. But more and more so, it has to do with its cost of capital. And this is what's really fascinating, because now when a corporate is looking to raise capital, whether it's debt or equity, and especially when it comes to debt capital, you have things such as green bonds, you have sustainability-linked loans, and the topic of ESG is no longer just a footnote. It is front and center, part of the application process, and it has a direct determination as to the terms of the loan, of the corporate bond that you're looking to float to the market, and you'll get preferential rates, you'll get preferential terms for that debt offering if you can demonstrate a much more robust approach towards ESG. And so whether or not the CFO and the CFO's office was really keen to implement ESG is sort of besides the point now. They're now jumping up and down saying, guys, we need to do this ESG stuff. I'm not entirely sure what it is yet, but we need to do it because it's hitting our bottom line. And that's really exciting for us, because now we're starting to see multiple worlds starting to collide, so to speak, right? And now you have the CFO's office saying, hey, let's get on top of this. This is not something we can really wait on anymore. So that's pretty great to see.
Okay, thank you very much, Jonathan. Natalie, you've got just a few seconds. On this topic of busting silos, what role does corporate culture play in this?
I think corporate culture plays a central role, because it's really what does the organization stand for? What does it's delivered through daily interactions with people, right? And a lot of times for a company, a mission and a strategy is what unites that activity. And so the way people operate, the spirit of collaboration, the spirit of transparency are all central to culture, and are central to ESG. And so therefore culture is involved automatically by default, because it's involving people and it's involving workflow.
Thank you. We're about to be cut off any second, but I'd like to leave you with Josh. I'm going to say goodbye to you now. Josh, What role are employee resource groups playing in the building of international bottom-up culture?
Yeah, well, I mean, as Natalie noted, culture and particularly the workforce is a huge driver of that. We're finding, the rise of the employee resource groups, which were introduced as a part of diversity and inclusion efforts in the 1990s, 2000s, have really taken on a new space, new importance as the vocal soul of the company. We find those what used to be thought of as niche groups really being expansive, and companies are talking about how much of their workforce is involved in these resource groups, often identity-based resource groups. So we see, that's stakeholder capitalism in action. If everyone wonders, is this all regulators? No. We think consumers, workforce, and shareholders are driving this from a market standpoint. And we're also going to start to see it through the electorate. This is not about institutions or governments doing things to inform, independent of the will of the people. And the will of the people is manifest inside companies through the workforce. And what we're seeing as the great resignation, globally, is really just the great reprioritization. Do I want to work for a company that doesn't align to my values? And as we start to see that take hold, as this kind of next generation becomes the generation, we stop thinking of it as a young workforce and rather think of it as the workforce. Get ready. The next 5 to 10 years are going to be, I think, very, very telling as to the direction that ESG goes.
Okay, Josh, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. See you next week.